So let's start with question number 7. Which are the various bindings supported by WCF and what is the difference between basic and WS HTTP bindings? Now in one of our previous videos we had talked about the A, B and C, that is address, binding and contracts. The address answers the where part of WCF. So in other words, where will your WCF be hosted? The contracts answers the what part of WCF, that what do you actually need to consume the WCF service. Do you need to pass in an object? Do you need to pass in strings? What kind of functions are associated, etc. And the binding answers the how part of WCF. So how will your data be transferred over the wire? So will you be using a HTTP? Will you be using TCP? So what we'll do is in this question, first we'll go through all the various kind of bindings supported by WCF, and then we'll take up two important bindings, that is basic HTTP binding and WS HTTP binding, because both of these bindings are look very much similar, but they have a huge difference. We will cover 5 important bindings in this slide. Definitely there are more bindings than what are mentioned in this slide, but covering these 5 bindings will cover most of the protocols, or I'll say rather cover most of the commonly used protocols. The first two ones, that is basic HTTP binding and WS HTTP binding, supports HTTP protocol. We'll be discussing more in detail about both of these binding in the coming up slide. Just for the current understanding, we can think about that when you want to transfer your SOAP message over HTTP binding, we need to make choice from one of these. If you want to transfer your SOAP message over TCP protocol, then net TCP binding is the way to go. In case you want to send messages, or in case you want to send your SOAP message between two WCF process in the same PC, then net named pipes binding is the way to go. If you want to send your SOAP message over MSMQ, you want to support asynchronous communication, then net MSMQ binding is the way to go. Okay, so these are the basic 5 types of bindings, and as I said that there are more bindings than this, but we will not be covering those. Now what we'll do is that we will take up these first 2 bindings, because both of these bindings look very much similar. We'll take both of these bindings and we'll try to understand that when to use a basic HTTP binding and when to use WS HTTP binding. If you want to summarize in one sentence that what is the difference between both of these bindings, then the difference is of WS-star specifications. Just for the revision's sake, just for the definition's sake, WS-star specification are nothing but they are standards which basically extend your web service capabilities. Now this extension of your web service capabilities can be in terms of security, in terms of reliability, in terms of transactions, etc. So what we can think about, the main difference between both of this binding is that WS HTTP binding is equal to basic HTTP binding plus some extra WS-star specifications. So drilling down further, and trying to understand that what basically are the differences between basic and HTTP bindings, WS HTTP binding, there are 6 important differences. I will not be covering all of these 6 important differences. What you can do is that you can pause this video and see these differences by yourself, but I will cover 2 important differences, or 2 important points from these differences, because I think both of these points will impact that should you be using basic or should you be using WS HTTP binding. The first important point is of security. Basic HTTP binding is your old web service type of binding. So whenever a SOAP message is sent using basic HTTP binding, it goes as a plain text, while in WS HTTP binding the data is encrypted and sent. It is not sent as a plain text. So the first important point which should come to your mind before making a decision is that basic HTTP binding sends SOAP messages using plain text, while WS HTTP binding sends data in an encrypted format. The second important difference is of compatibility. WS HTTP binding is supported only by .NET clients made in 3.0 framework and above, while basic HTTP binding supports right from 1.x till .NET 3.x. So in case you are looking for backward compatibility, or in case you are looking forward for supporting more older .NET framework clients, then basic HTTP binding is a way to go. So these are the 2 important differences. two important differences which you should consider while implementing basic HTTP binding or WS HTTP binding. Now what we'll do is that we'll do a small practical and try to understand that how the security feature, that means in other words we'll try to see that how basic HTTP binding sends data as a plain text, and how WS HTTP binding basically encrypts the data and sends your SOAP messages. So here's a small practical demo which I have made to make understand the difference much clearer and in a more practical format. So here's one project which I have, which basically hosts your WCF service using basic HTTP binding, and there's other project which basically hosts your service using WS HTTP binding. In order to host your service using basic HTTP binding, you need to just make the binding changes to your endpoint tag. So if you go to the web config file, I have given this project binding as basic HTTP binding. If you go to the WS HTTP project, you will see that the binding is given as WS HTTP binding, right? So both of these projects I have configured. Then I have consumed both of this service in a web client consumer. Okay, so in order to consume your WS HTTP binding, you need to add as a service reference, right? In order to consume your WCF basic HTTP binding, you need to add as a web reference. Why you need to add as a web reference? Because this is an old ASMX style of consuming, or old ASMX style of web service. Okay, then I have made a simple page, and it has two buttons. One button basically invokes a basic HTTP, and the other one basically invokes my WS HTTP, right? Now what I've done is that I have downloaded HTTP Analyzer tool. Now this tool basically sniffs and says that sniffs and gathers data which has been posted, or which has been posted, and the response data from response data of your traffic. It basically monitors your traffic. Okay, so here's my project which I've made running. Let me clear everything in HTTP Analyzer. Okay, you can get HTTP Analyzer from www.ieinspector.com. Okay, so what I'll do is first I will invoke basic HTTP. The HTTP Analyzer catches the request and response, and you can see that in the post data nothing is encrypted. The value 4220 is which I have sent through the client, and that's in plain text format. Now what I'll do is I'll go and invoke WS HTTP. Now again the HTTP Analyzer has caught the data, or it has sniffed the data, and let's go and see. You will see that the post data is now in an encrypted format. So in other words, WS HTTP sends by default SOAP message in an encrypted format, while your WCF basic basically sends data in a simple text format, right? So you can get this source code from wsquestpointvd.com, or if you have bought the DVD, you can get the source code from there. So what you can do is that you can download the source code, run it, okay, and run your HTTP Analyzer and see for yourself the difference of how the SOAP message is transferred. SOAP message is transported, using both of these protocols. Okay, so the consideration which you should take, that when you should use a basic HTTP and when you should use WS HTTP are on 2 points. The first important point is that, are you looking for a backward compatibility? Are you looking at .NET clients which are less than 3.0 to also consume your service? In case if you're looking forward to consume a wide variety of .NET clients, then you should be using basic HTTP. But in case you are looking forward for clients, .NET clients which are only built in 3.0 and above, then WS HTTP is the way to go. A point to be remembered: WS HTTP encrypts the message, while the basic HTTP sends the SOAP message in a plain text format.